1945 was a tumultuous year. It saw fierce fighting, peace, and the beginnings of a new world order. The Allies were determined to inflict total defeat on their enemies at any cost. But following victory, the big three, Britain, America, and the Soviet Union, fought each other for supremacy. The shape of the world we live in today is the legacy of events of 1945. In this program, we'll see how in March, the Allied forces face fanatical Nazi resistance. And the Western Allies discover the horrors of the Nazi regime. In April, the Americans finally land on Japanese soil, but at great cost to life on both sides. The Americans allow Stalin to take Berlin as his prize, and Britain starts to realize they're out in the cold. By March, the Western Allies were fighting in Germany. They had crushed Hitler's last desperate attempt to alter the outcome of the war in Europe at the Battle of the Bulge. Winning had been very costly, so the Allies continued to push on, but cautiously.
Everyone thinks that once the Battle of the Bulge is over, that there's then a great lull. Well, there isn't. There are two massive offensives going on. First of all, in the south, the Americans are battering away, and the British and the Canadians are actually fighting in northern Germany, taking really serious casualties until they close up on the Rhine by March. If you look at the casualties that are suffered by the Allies in that period, in that winter fighting, it's actually quite bitter, brutal fighting.
The Western Allied generals had very different approaches to the final assault on Germany, and tensions ran high. Britain's Montgomery pressed hard for a pointed, sharp thrust towards Berlin. However, Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander, ordered a steady advance into Germany on a broad front.
The British commander, Montgomery, was strongly demanding that the pace of the attack on the Germans should be raised. Eisenhower refused. Eisenhower didn't want to waste American lives in a race for Berlin.
And here was Eisenhower, absolutely determined that although he was going to push on into Germany, he was not going to have any more nasty surprises. He was going to do it very slowly and carefully. And he didn't really see any advantage in pushing hard and fast, because the Allied zones of occupation in Germany had already been agreed. So all they wanted to do was complete the defeat of the Nazis at the lowest possible cost.
The Allies were closing in on both sides. The Red Army was busy bringing up supplies and men for the final assault on Berlin itself. On the 4th of March, they established a bridgehead across the River Oder, just to the east of the city. For the Western Allies, crossing the Rhine was to present a major problem. Retreating Germans had hurriedly blown up all the river's bridges. But there was one still standing at Remagen, which the explosives had only managed to weaken. 2 weeks ahead of schedule, the Americans crossed.
The last great offensive on the west is the attack across the Rhine. And Montgomery, in his rather slow and careful way, closes up. And there's going to be a big set-piece crossing of the Rhine. First of all, the Americans seize the bridge at Remagen and scuttle across it quickly. Hitler's furious and orders the 4 officers to be shot, and he throws everything against the bridge, but by that time the Americans have established a bridgehead.
The Americans' premature crossing of the Rhine infuriated Montgomery, but Eisenhower sent reinforcements to help secure the bridgehead. In fact, the weakened bridge only held for a few days, but it gave the newsreels something positive to report.
Further upstream at Remagen, the Americans are over already. Across the bridge that some patriot of Hitler's Germany forgot to blow properly. But though still a bridge, its girders are cut through. Its weakened steelwork groans under impossible strains. After only a day or so, the entire structure falls into the Rhine, but its job is done. The Americans are over in strength.
Some 8,000 Americans managed to cross the river before the bridge collapsed. The Nazis were prepared to defend their homeland to the last, but they were desperately short of men and firepower. This situation was made worse by Hitler's determination to fight on too many fronts, including the one in Italy, its former ally. Sicily was invaded by the Western Allies in July 1943. Soon after, Mussolini was deposed. The new Italian government surrendered just before the main Allied invasion of Italy started.
We assumed when we entered Italy at the time of the Italian surrender in October 1943 that we would simply advance up Italy. And suddenly we read Hitler's own orders saying that the Germans will put up a fight.
One of the other forgotten fronts that the Germans have to cope with and the Allies cope with is Italy. And someone called it the tough old gut because Churchill had said something like, it's the soft underbelly of Europe. Well, it wasn't. And the Germans actually fought very hard in a 600-day campaign, nearly 2 years. At the end of the day, it actually, ironically, causes the Germans more harm than the Allies because it gives the Germans 500,000 casualties. So it's a diversion and, if you like, a bleeding sore to Hitler.
Through March, the preparations for the crossing of the Rhine continued. Churchill insisted on seeing the operation personally, despite concerns over his safety. Working as an engineer was William Lowbridge.
I was in the front of the assault in crossing the Rhine. It was our job to bulldoze the ramps down to the river. The Germans were firing heavily at us. There was a huge explosion at one point. I looked behind. 24 men had been hit by a shell that had landed yards away.
Crossing the Rhine was a massive operation, involving nearly 60,000 engineers, the construction of hundreds of pontoons, and transporting tons of supplies. They even used smoke machines to conceal troop movements from the German artillery. The main crossing began on the 24th of March, led by the 15th Scottish Division and followed by 120,000 American troops. At the same time, a massive operation to land paratroopers and gliders behind enemy lines commenced. These courageous men faced fierce ground fire and suffered serious losses.
Typical Montgomery launches this huge, almost mini D-Day crossing the Rhine, where it's very wide, it's 500 yards wide, in some parts it's 1,000 yards wide. He uses marines and landing craft and smoke and bombers, and there's this tremendous set-piece battle where he crosses the Rhine and establishes himself on the eastern bank of the Rhine, and they are like a dagger pointing into the heart of the Ruhr, and it's really the beginning of the end for Germany.
The German soldiers, now out of fuel and food, were forced to beg for supplies from local factories. They were an easy target for the Americans, as 19-year-old Curtis Whiteway witnessed.
I pulled out my binoculars and scanned the field above us. Dead and dying Germans were all over the field, some crying out in great pain, others lay motionless. Some of the wounded started to cry out the names of their loved ones, over and over. Then more cried out as they were dying ever so slowly. It was eerie and ran chills up one's spine to have to sit there and listen to the cries of so many men. It went on for hours as dusk fell. Then slowly, one by one, the men on the field stopped calling out as they died that night.
Now on the other side of the Rhine, the Western Allies did not rush for Berlin. Instead, they moved forward cautiously. They did not want to throw away their men's lives when the end was in sight.
When you had this overwhelming superiority of firepower, of artillery, and air power. It was a perfectly natural feeling that if you're infantry soldiers and you're marching along a road and you come under fire, well, there are two ways of doing it. Either you can be a hero and you can get up and throw yourself at the enemy, as a few people did, and most of them were killed, or you can sit there in the ditch by the road and call on the radio for huge artillery bombardment or airstrikes, which will probably winkle out the Germans in a few hours or a few days and may well save your neck.
In the Pacific, the Americans had made headway against the Japanese, but they realized that there was going to be no easy victory.
The Americans are closing in. The Americans are closing in two different directions. One, in the central Pacific, the US Navy is pushing in, heading for the Japanese islands. And then down in the south, you've got MacArthur sweeping up through the Philippines. And these two prongs are pushing in.
The island of Iwo Jima was secured by the 26th of March. The Japanese were also under attack in Burma. British and Indian troops had turned up the pressure. Their strategic aim was to open up a vital supply route into China. By mid-March, they'd recaptured the city of Mandalay. For some months now, Japan had been unable to defend itself from air raids. The Americans had been bombing their cities continuously. Then, in mid-March, they switched to a much more deadly, low-level firebombing strategy.
The United States Army Air Force institutes a campaign to firebomb the Japanese cities. They are hugely successful. The only thing that stops them going on is they actually run out of firebombs.
On the night of the 9th of March, the Americans dropped 1,700 tons of incendiary bombs. Some 16 square miles of Tokyo were destroyed, and over 100,000 people died in the firestorm. It was the most destructive conventional raid of the war against Japan.
The American public were very aware of the firebombing of Tokyo, and the public reaction was largely very positive. It's really interesting to see how American public attitudes towards the use of immense violence against civilians altered during the war. When the war broke out, Roosevelt's first public intervention was to plead for all sides not to descend to the barbarity of attacking civilians. By 1945, the massive scale firebombing of Japanese cities was accepted by the American public. Huge support, and this was opinion poll. 75–80% of the American public approved those kinds of firebombings. Of course, there wasn't reporting in the American media which showed the cost of human lives. There was very little in Time or Life magazine which would give them an impression of the way in which, for example, Japanese people in Tokyo boiled alive by jumping into canals and ponds as the city was burning around them. So in that sense, it was easier for Americans to applaud these kinds of tactics.
In the Pacific, on the 1st of April, the Americans started their invasion of the island of Okinawa. The Japanese allowed them to land on the beaches. As the Americans advanced inland, only then did the Japanese unleash a fanatical attack.
At Okinawa, the Americans also discover a horrible truth about dealing with Japanese civilians. Not only is the whole Japanese garrison killed off eventually, not only do the Americans have to get them out by what they call blowtorch and corkscrew operations, which means basically put a flamethrower down every trench and then throw a grenade in to get the Japanese out. When they finally take the island, the Japanese civilians line up. They have a fantastic last banzai bayonet charge, and they have to be dealt with. The Japanese generals commit mass suicide, and the Japanese civilians jump off the cliff. The fanaticism of Japanese resistance on Okinawa shocks the Americans, it shocks the American planners, and it makes them realize if they're going to try and take Japan proper, it would be like eating a porcupine.
Fighting in the Pacific and Asia would continue for a further 4 months. In Europe, the war was nearly over. but Allied soldiers uncovered the Nazi concentration camps. This was an even greater shock to a world weary of war. In Germany, advancing Allies found a demoralized and impoverished population and an army that knew it was defeated. Hitler continued to mount desperate counterattacks which made no military sense but resulted in thousands of deaths. And he ordered retreating forces to destroy as much as they could, blowing up dams and burning buildings.
Hitler in the last months of the war made plain that it was a matter of absolutely no interest to him at all who did or did not survive, or what of his own country did or did not survive defeat. And indeed, he seemed to have decided that if he could not have victory, that at the very least he would have a cataclysm worthy of the Third Reich as he saw it. It's as if the Nazis in those last months, there they were clinging by their fingernails to the precipice, and they knew that they were going to fall in. And they just wanted to drag with them as much of humanity as they could possibly achieve.
Once over the Rhine, the Allies attempted to take Germany's industrial heartland, the Ruhr. It is debatable if any real armaments were still being produced there. What is certain is that the Allies found themselves facing an enemy whose morale was finally starting to collapse. They surrendered in large numbers. Securing, housing, and feeding these prisoners of war slowed the Allied advance even further.
In the spring of '45, when the Americans break through and encircle in the Ruhr pocket Modell's army with its 400,000 men. And there are many stories told of Germans surrendering en masse when the great psychological collapse happens in April 1945, surrendering to the Allies and saying, now we've got your tanks, will you help us keep the Russians at bay?
The Germans were terrified by the Red Army advance because it was known that the Germans had behaved appallingly in the east, and they knew that they would be shown no mercy by the Red Army troops who'd lost relatives in the fighting on the Eastern Front.
The Red Army had to wait for reinforcements for the final assault on Berlin. Further south, they had liberated Hungary by the 4th of April. And by the 13th, after fierce resistance, they had taken the Austrian capital, Vienna. As the Nazis retreated, they forced millions of prisoners to march back into Germany, rather than allow them to be liberated by the advancing Allies. The Western Allied prisoners had been reasonably well treated during captivity. Now, they found themselves in the same situation as those the Third Reich deemed second-class citizens. Poles, Russians, Gypsies, and other so-called antisocial groups. All were forced on infamous death marches to new camps.
2 weeks later, we were on the move again, this time in cattle trucks southwards to the satellite camps of Buchenwald near Leipzig. But not for long. Soon we were being forced east. We could hear the Americans bombing. After no food, water, or sleep for 3 days, we were wildly hallucinating. It was at this moment 4 of us decided to escape, even though we knew we'd be shot if the sniffer dogs found us. But it didn't matter. Leaving ourselves to the fate of God, we lay hidden in a ditch by the side of the road. Miraculously, the dogs missed us.
Many on these terrible marches were civilians that had been taken from occupied territories and forced to work as slave labor for the Third Reich.
One of the biggest problems for the Nazi Empire in 1944-45 was it was desperately short of manpower, that every man capable of bearing arms had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht or the SS and sent to fight. And that left them desperately short of people to keep the factories going in Germany, to build the tanks, the shells. The only way that they could keep the factories going was by using slaves, conscripted labourers.
There were 7.5 million or so labourers, foreign labourers in Germany, by the end of the later stages of the Second World War. They were extremely badly treated. Many of them died in terrible circumstances, particularly in places like Camp Dora, where the V2 rocket was manufactured.
It is estimated that by the end of the war, the Germans held as many as 10 million men, women and children as prisoners.
The Nazis also killed at least 3 million Russian prisoners, 3 million, in concentration camps, slave labor camps. And by 1945, imprisonment had become the largest single industry in the Reich.
The Nazis were also holding millions of Jews captive, who they'd planned to kill in the gas chambers of the extermination camps. Though Auschwitz had been found by the Red Army at the end of January, its horrors hadn't been made public in the West. Then, on the 15th of April, the Western Allies entered Belsen.
There had been certainly some knowledge, rumours in the press about the concentration camps in Germany, what was happening to the Jews. But it was really the liberation of Belsen which absolutely shocked. I think nothing had prepared anyone for the horrors that there were there. And they were shown on newsreel, I think on Pathé News. And there was very much the feeling that people must see these. They had a responsibility to see the inhumanity of mankind and, of course, in a sense, a justification of why they had been fighting Germany. You know, they were fighting evil, and this was the manifestation of that.
I've been here 8 days. This morning we buried over 5,000 bodies. We don't know who they are. Behind me you can see a pit which will contain another 5,000.
I am the officer commanding the Regiment of Royal Artillery guarding this camp. Our most unpleasant task has been making the SS, of which there are about 50, bury the dead. Up to press, we have buried about 17,000 people.
My name is Gunnar Illingworth and I live at Cheshire. I'm at present in Belsen camp doing guard duty over the SS men.
April 1945.
1945.
Ich heiße Franz Hössler. Ist der 23. April.
The things in this camp are beyond describing. When you actually see them for yourselves, you know what you're fighting for here. Pictures in the paper cannot describe it at all. The things they have committed, well, nobody would think they were human at all.
For some, the impact of what they saw was overwhelming.
Of course, there'd always been stories about Nazi atrocities, but Belsen really brought it home. Belsen was a terrible shock to absolutely everybody.
Another camp, Buchenwald, revealed more atrocities. And then on the 29th, Dachau was liberated. The press and politicians were taken to these camps. It was widely reported, and even department stores put up displays of what had been uncovered.
Swan and Edgar department store at Piccadilly Circus. They cleared their ground floor and brought in the first photographs of concentration camps when the photographs were released in 1945. The newspapers and the radio urged us that we should brave it and go and look at the pictures. Some were very large, some of them life-sized, on the walls. It was a shock of man's inhumanity to man, and everyone was hushed as they walked around, looking.
In the House of Commons, Churchill spoke for the nation, saying, "No words can express our horror." But the discovery of Belsen galvanized the Allies to deal the final blow to the heart of the Nazi regime. By early April, victory was now certain. The Red Army had amassed 2.5 million men at the River Oder. Also within sight of Berlin was the US Army. By the 12th of April, they had crossed the River Elbe near the town of Magdeburg. But then, just a short distance from Berlin, the Americans paused.
But then suddenly, as the Western Allied armies close up to the Elbe, Berlin sort of fades from the picture. And suddenly, Eisenhower sends this signal to Stalin, without consulting anybody, to Churchill's fury, saying there's no intention on our part of going to Berlin. Stalin didn't believe him. He couldn't believe anyone would openly forego the prize. But Eisenhower took the decision which many of us think was the entirely rational one, that it had already been agreed that Berlin would fall in the middle of the Soviet zone of occupation. What was the point at that last gasp of the war of getting tens of thousands of American and British soldiers killed for a symbolic victory? Stopping at the Elbe was the most rational thing they could have done.
Even before the Allies entered Germany, they had agreed how it would be run once defeated. It would be divided into 4 zones which each Ally would occupy and govern.
It was agreed that the demarcation line between the part of Europe occupied by the Red Army and the Soviet Union and by the Western Allies, the British and Americans and French, was going to be the River Elbe. On that basis, there was no point the British and Americans racing for Berlin. On the other hand, Stalin didn't trust the British and Americans, and he thought that they would make a last-minute rush for Berlin if he didn't get there first.
The Allies had agreed Germany's fate, but there was no such agreement about the rest of Europe. The Red Army fought relentlessly in the knowledge that the countries they liberated would be under their control.
I think Stalin wanted to go as far forward as possible. He certainly, for example, wanted to install a communist government in Italy. Now, whether that would have required, had the Soviets reached Italy, clearly that would have been, as in the case of Czechoslovakia, Poland, Romania, Hungary, Albania, it would have meant a Soviet government. So moving forward was important for his political agenda, and he had his people, as far as Italy was concerned, he already had his people ready in Moscow to go and form a government.
Red Army advances were key to Stalin's political objectives. His soldiers were motivated to fight hard, and little notice was taken of their individual sacrifices.
I was part of Red Army liberating forces. We swept across Latvia border to border. At Riga, I was wounded in the right shoulder, but I just continued fighting and moving onwards. Unless you were dead or your leg had been ripped off, no one would send you home for sick leave.
The Western Allies took Nuremberg on the 17th of April and were now deep into eastern Germany. On the 19th, Leipzig fell, and then on the 23rd, they took Frankfurt. Goering, based with most of the military staff at Hitler's Alpine retreat, was disgusted at the loss of Frankfurt. Enraged, he sent the Führer a telegram demanding his resignation. In response, Hitler ordered Goering's arrest, but he was ignored.
The final days for Hitler in April 1945 must be dreadful, because his world has come apart. He's got this Götterdämmerung on the twilight of the gods. He's bringing the German people down in flames, and right at the end, his Nazi party colleagues betray him. Totally. Goering says, "My Führer, as you're trapped in Berlin, I will set up and run the Nazi party from down here."
Berlin was in ruins. There was no electricity and no water. But it was the symbolic prize that Stalin wanted for the Soviet Union. He set 2 of his generals on a race to take the city.
Stalin was determined to throw the Red Army towards Berlin as fast as possible, and he had a brilliant way of doing this. He took 2 of his commanders aside, Zhukov and Konyev, and without quite saying so, in explicit terms. He let it be known that one of them was going to be known as the victor. And it was up to them to race to Berlin, to smash through the German defences, and whoever won, won.
But Zhukov and Konev had a particular rivalry, and what Stalin therefore did was to essentially organise a race. What happened was that Zhukov got stalled, and it took him 3 days to fight his way up onto this rather difficult obstacle.
His men struggled through sodden ground covered in landmines. They faced a German army with nothing left to lose. Finally, after 3 days, they broke through. And then their artillery started to batter the outskirts of Berlin.
Meanwhile, Konev, his penetration was much, much more successful, and he stumbled across one of the first autobahns, a motorway, which goes straight up into the south of Berlin.
A city that was now defended by old men and boys.
One of the things the Germans do towards the end, Hitler does, he brings out what's called the Volkssturm, who are old men and young children. These are basically kids and old men who are given an anti-tank bazooka and sent out to hold the line against the advancing hordes.
On the 21st of April, Zhukov's army started its final assault on Berlin. The two generals had massed nearly 500,000 men against just 45,000 German troops, 40,000 old men and 3,000 children.
I think it's very hard for us in the West to understand just how big the Soviet offensive was. 160 divisions closing in on Berlin, massive effort. 300,000 Russians killed, I think, in the fighting before Berlin. These are colossal casualties and give some idea of the effort the Soviets put in.
Zhukov and Konev had shown themselves through the battles of the last 2 years to be probably the most brilliant commanders of large forces in the Second World War. And yet, in their burning impatience and rivalry to be the first into Berlin, goaded by Stalin all the time, saying which of you is going to become the hero of the Berlin battle, they threw away their lives, their men, with a recklessness that no Allied commander would have dreamed of.
In the last few terrible days of fighting, Germans were also sacrificed in their tens of thousands. Those not killed by the Red Army's onslaught were executed by the SS if they dared to hide from the fighting to save their own life.
And there's one very good story told about a young lad who's in the front line fighting for Berlin, and his house is just 2 blocks away. So he leaves the front line just to see his mum. He's not deserting, he's just going to see her and go back again. And on the way, 1 block away, he's stopped by a Nazi Party official or a Gestapo chap who says, "Who are you doing? What are you doing?" And he's hanged on a lamppost, a block from his mother's house, as an example, allegedly, to all the rest who might desert. Of course, they won't, because they're fighting for their lives, with a sign around his neck saying, "I'm a deserter." And that's one of the many tragic little stories of Berlin and the young fighters of Berlin in the last days, many of whom actually died in the rubble.
By the 27th of April, the Red Army had reached Alexanderplatz, the center of Berlin. They were just half a mile from Hitler's bunker on Wilhelmstrasse. The final pockets of German resistance had to be flushed out. But after so much sacrifice, the ultimate prize, Hitler's surrender, would elude the Red Army. For 4 long years, the Eastern and Western Allied soldiers had fought the Nazis. Finally, the two Allied forces met face to face at Torgau on the River Elbe. On the 25th of April, American and Soviet Union soldiers shook hands.
Then on the Elbe River, boats cross and men wave from opposite banks. With the meeting of Russians and Americans, Germany has been cut in half. The end is now very near indeed. The end that all cannot wait to see.
I think it's very interesting the reaction of the Americans and the British when they first encountered the Soviets coming from the east. I think they were surprised at the sophistication of the forward elements of the Red Army. There's a famous quotation from one British soldier who said that a tank commander was covered in aerials and looked like a man from Mars. We also see film of the Americans meeting the Russians at Torgau on the Elbe, and the Russians are all carrying rather nice cameras, which have presumably been looted from Germans. But the Red Army by 1945 really looks like a professional army.
The Allied generals had ignored the agreed zones of occupation in order to beat Germany. But now that the Nazis were on their last legs, political maneuvering between the big three Allied powers began.
The American troops actually advanced very far into the areas which were allocated to the Soviets. The Soviets got Berlin, which was surely the greatest prize, but the American troops advanced right through the area allocated to the Soviets. So the dispute between Churchill and Eisenhower and between Churchill and Roosevelt was, don't withdraw your troops. Now at least you've got so far into Germany, don't withdraw your troops until we have a proper arrangement with the Soviets. And the Soviets said, no, this is our area, leave it to us. And so Eisenhower pulled back his troops, and Churchill was, to put it mildly, very distressed. He felt Eisenhower doesn't understand the political aspect, and he uses that argument with Eisenhower. He's quite open about it. You don't understand the political aspect.
And Stalin was absolutely determined that the USSR would come out of the Second World War a global power respected by the United Kingdom and especially by the United States of America.
The only thing that Churchill was able to do, and that was when we learned that the Soviets were planning to enter Denmark and to control the whole of the Baltic. And therefore, Churchill ordered Montgomery to go straight across north of Berlin, ignore Berlin, go to the Baltic shore, and cut the Soviets off from Denmark. So that was one area where, if you like, the British policy of minimizing the Soviet advantage in the last months and weeks of the war was effective.
In Italy, the Nazis were retreating. With his protectors gone, Mussolini, the fascist dictator, was flushed out by Italian resistance forces. They captured and shot him and his mistress, Clara Petacci, on the 28th of April. Their bodies were put on public display in Milan. In Germany, the Nazis were also facing their last few days.
For a minority of Germans who were committed, fanatical Nazis, particularly in organisations like the SS, of course, the defeat was something they were very reluctant to accept. And these are the people who wanted to keep on fighting and who were very much inclined to commit suicide if they did not, once they realised that it was all up. Something between 10 and 20% of all the senior Nazi leaders killed themselves, the regional leaders, the Gauleiter, the top members of the SS. So a large number of the top echelons of the most committed and fanatical Nazis saw absolutely no future and thought that they were dying a kind of sacrificial death for Germany.
The Second World War at least tens of thousands, many tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, we shall never know for sure, of Germans kill themselves in their despair because they believed that after the Third Reich there would be nothing, there would be just emptiness, there would be no future for them at all.
A teenage girl wrote in her diary about the terrible price some women had to pay in defeat.
She was 17 and she described very vividly service with the Nazi labor service, and then how she and her sister were cowering in their apartment in Berlin with their parents when the Red Army burst in. And both the girls were repeatedly raped. And the girl wrote in her diary, and I was still not yet 18. And when the Red soldiers left and the family were left sobbing, their mother said to them, "Your honor is gone, you have nothing left to live for. You can only die." Their own mother took these girls up on the roof of their apartment building and told them to jump, while their father stood on the pavement underneath and implored them not to. Well, in the end, after 10 minutes, the girls burst into tears and ran back in the building and survived.
Hitler's bunker was surrounded, but he refused to be taken alive. On the 29th of April, Hitler wrote his last will and testament. He then married his mistress, Eva Braun.
And he then discovers, just before he commits suicide, that Himmler, the Trauer Heimlich, has actually set up quite illicit peace talks with the Swedes. And Hitler, in his rage and his bunker right at the end of the day, realizes his old trusted colleagues have betrayed him.
The next day at 3:30 p.m., Hitler shot himself. His mistress killed herself with poison. Hitler's body was then incinerated by SS bodyguards. The petrol cans were found later. The Red Army had focused their firepower on the German parliament.
It's particularly interesting that they went not for the chancellery below which the Führer's bunker was. They actually went for the Reichstag, the old German parliament building. Now, actually, the Reichstag had been gutted by fire in 1933, so it was a ruin. But on the front of the Reichstag, it says, over the entrance, it says, "Dem deutschen Volk," to the German people. And I think that symbolism may have been one reason why the Russians made that the target which would certify victory, because it was their revenge against the Germans. Also, of course, the Reichstag was a huge building. It was relatively isolated. It's surrounded by quite open terrain.
Thousands of fanatical Nazis had dug in around the Reichstag. They wanted to die defending the glory of Germany. The Red Army soldiers had to fight each and every one to take this last remaining symbol of the German state. Then finally, late in the evening of the 30th of April, two men climbed into the remaining shell of what had once been Germany's parliament and hoisted the red victory banner.
The film shows the red flag, the famous victory banner, being hoisted over the Reichstag. Now, the film is a reconstruction because when the flag was actually hoisted, it was dark. It was the night of the 30th of April.
Some friends and I went to the Reichstag. Our immediate reaction was to write something like, "The Russian occupying forces were here," but we had nothing to write with. But I was proud of my country and my army. We had managed to free so many people from the fascists.
Germany had been defeated. Europe was overrun, countries and people destroyed. But the Allied leaders soon realized that a new battle for control of Europe was about to begin.